We have a really special guest speaker next. If you have heard of this book, The Life of Yogananda, written by Phil Goldberg, we have the author Phil Goldberg with us today to share on Yogananda, 100 Years of High Impact Transmission. I just want to let you know, if you have not read this book, it is a must-read about Yogananda's life. We have it here for sale. Phil will sign it for you afterwards. In the room right out the hallway, right outside here, we have a table outside. The hardcover is on sale today. This is an incredible book. It gives you such appreciation for Yogananda and the heart that he brought to America. I'm going to introduce my friend and mystic and author and journeyman, Phil Goldberg.
Thank you. Greetings, everybody here. I am always honored to speak in the context of Ananda, and especially today when we're kind of celebrating the beginning and end of Yogananda's monumental time in America. So this year we're celebrating the centennial of his arrival. And today, March 7th, we're celebrating the end of that journey, of the day of his Mahasamadhi. And I have to tell you, in researching and writing a biography of Yogananda, those two landmarks were the most moving for me to write. Writing about his early days in Boston in 1920, and then writing about the last days and last night of his life were the most moving parts of sort of absorbing as best I could what his life was like. Imagine, you arrive in a place you've never been in 1920, and there was no YouTube. There were, maybe you saw footage from silent movies of what America looked like. But I don't know if Yogananda had ever met an American prior to coming here. But 1920, when he arrived, there was a presidential campaign going on that Warren G. Harding would win. The Harding-Coolidge ticket would win. And women were gearing up to vote for the first time. Think of it. And radio had just been invented. It was not yet a household item. There were automobiles, but they were luxury items. It was not yet a car culture. All that would come very soon. And mass media was essentially if a newspaper article got syndicated. That was how word got around, magazines. And you're a dark-skinned guy in orange clothing with long hair at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was resurgent and racism in places like Boston was so virulent that it was not only African Americans affected, but Jews and Irish people who were considered other race. So it was one of the things you learn researching a life like Yogananda's is how difficult the task was that he took on as somebody with a mission to bring what would be received, what would be seen by many Americans as a heathen, false religion. And he had to face, as did his predecessors, a great deal of bigotry and prejudice and resistance. But the other side of American life, and we see both of those sides still very much with us 100 years later, the other side of America is this open-minded, curious, pragmatic streak of the culture that will accept and at least investigate something new if it promises to be at all useful or at all life-affirming, and if it offered a measure of self-improvement. And that's what Yogananda learned to tap into. As you know, he came and his first talk was called The Science of Religion. Now think of that. That would have been a very odd concept in 1920, probably still is to many people. But we would have thought, especially in those days, of that being an oxymoron, because how could science and religion be compatible, and how could there be a science of religion? He would have been seen as a Hindu. They would have been seen in religious terms, not as a yogi. This was a long time before he wrote Autobiography of a Yogi and not Autobiography of a Hindu. And that matters, because what he was speaking about that day and would continue speaking about that day could be categorized as Hindu teachings if you have an orientation towards seeing the world the way we in the West divide up religious traditions. Or you could look at it as he was introducing a facet of yoga and of Vedanta philosophy. And yoga was always a science of religion, or maybe we would prefer to say a science of spirituality. And he outlined that day. Now, here we are 100 years later. Many of you may know that prior to writing this biography of Yogananda, I wrote a book called American Veda, which covers 200 years of the transmission of the core teachings of India's ancient wisdom into America and the impact it has had on our lives. And I've continued to sort of chronicle that. And that impact has been extraordinary. It's one under-recognized. But if you look at the religious and spiritual landscape of America now, even more than when I published American Veda 9 or 10 years ago, we have become, and are fast becoming more, what I call a nation of yogis. If you look at the data of what and I don't mean by that, there are hatha yoga studios on every street corner. That's only a small part of it. What I mean by that is if you look at the studies of how Americans understand religion and spirituality and how they exercise the spiritual impulse in their own lives, we're becoming a nation of yogis. By that I mean there are millions of people in America who see the world through a yogic frame, a Vedantic frame, or an Eastern frame, however you want to express it, who see religion less as matter of belief and doctrine and dogma, and more as a matter of inner experience. There are more people practicing one form of meditation or another now than there ever was. There are people practicing forms of meditation that derive from the Vedic and the yogic tradition and don't even know they are, because their church teaches it and they think their preacher invented it or something, or their rabbi. There are people chanting Sanskrit mantras in groups doing kirtan because it feels good. and because it elevates their spirituality. Tomorrow morning in churches all over America, they might be having periods of silence, whereas in the past they may have just prayed out loud. There are people doing mindfulness in hospitals and therapy, and I get mailings from Kaiser Permanente, which is my healthcare provider, and the last one I got was telling me it'd be good, I should meditate. And I said, you're 50 years too late in my case. But, this would not have happened a few decades ago or a decade ago. People in corporations having meditation rooms and yoga classes. This is a real transformation of spiritual life in America. It's not just that. It's been found to be useful for stress reduction and good health. It's also how people are more and more increasingly expressing their spiritual instincts. If you look at surveys, you've all heard the term spiritual but not religious. And it's now, it's a sort of category in research, people calling themselves that. And that category of people who have an active spiritual life but do not affiliate or do not identify with a particular organized religion has grown to the point where it's like the second biggest category in religious life, in the way they study these things. What are those people doing if they're spiritual but not religious? If they have a spiritual life but they're not affiliated with an organized religion? They're doing some form of practice, and chances are it derives from India. Contemplative Christianity, through people like Richard Rohr and the late Thomas Keating, is enormous now. And forms of spiritual practice have come out of the closet that were buried in the Jewish and Hindu and Christian traditions for a long, long time, because people like Keating and Rohr said, why? Well, we must have forms of meditation too, like the Indians, like the Buddhists, Hindus. All this, especially among young people, who are the biggest proportion of people saying they're spiritual but not religious, is changing the spiritual landscape of America. And it has everything to do with the transmission that came from India, first in the form of books back in the early 19th century, when people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were reading these books and transforming. I always think of Emerson as the founding father of spiritual but not religious. And if we don't have time, but go back and look at some of Emerson's work, and especially his famous address to Harvard Divinity School, and you'll see what I mean, where he tells these people, we don't need you preaching about God. Give them an experience of God. This is in the mid-19th century. Yogananda is of paramount importance in this story of Eastern traditions impacting life in the West. And that impact is deep and profound and enduring. Now, we're here to celebrate Yogananda, but it should be said, and he would want me to say, I believe, that he didn't do it alone. He stood on the shoulders of his illustrious predecessor, Swami Vivekananda, and the link between those two is fascinating. You can read about it in my book, because Yogananda spent his teenage years in Calcutta, a short walk from where Vivekananda grew up, and his family home. And there's all these connections. So Vivekananda, I always call the Jackie Robinson of this story, because he was the first, and he set the tone. and paved the way for others. So if he was the Jackie Robinson, I hope some of you know what I'm talking about. If he was the Jackie Robinson, then Yogananda was like the Willie Mays or the Henry Eyre, one that came later and carried this thing even further, even more deeply, and faced the same obstacles and the same racism and the same prejudices. And Yogananda, in turn, paved the way for all the gurus and swamis and yoga masters and Buddhist monks who came in the 60s or 70s. And there was a whole parade of them, as many of you know, because things changed. And but those people were able to succeed because of the work Yogananda had done between 1920 and 1952. Through the Roaring Twenties, through the Great Depression, through World War II, through the beginning of the Cold War and the atomic age, all that monumental history of the 20th century, he was working to implant these universal, central, core teachings that come from the ancient rishis of India into American life, and adapting at every turn. And I want to emphasize the skill that it takes to adapt something from one culture to another. This was one of Yogananda's great gifts. And all the gurus who were famous did the same, but he in many ways set the stages for the ones to come and set the template and showed how it could be done. Some of you will go to an Ananda center tomorrow morning and have a Sunday service. They don't have Sunday services in India, except in places like Ananda or the Ramakrishna Mission, which adapted to that form. He, as you all know, realized at one point in the 1920s he could not directly teach every student the way it is done in India, guru to devotee. There were too many people. The demand was too much. America was too big. So some of the teachings got transmitted in a correspondence course. This was the height of technology in the 1920s. The Sears Roebuck catalog had changed commerce in America. It was like the Amazon of its day. It was, oh my goodness, you could get a catalog with all these items, and you could clip a coupon and send in a check, and a week or two later, your lamp or your hat or your gloves would arrive on your doorstep. And now you could get these teachings in mail order. People who were more orthodox about how these teachings were supposed to be transmitted did not approve of this. And he had to deal with that. And so it had Vivekananda, so did the gurus of the 60s, because they were democratizing what had gotten in India to be restricted to certain people getting certain teachings at certain times in certain ways. There was a big democratization. And Yogananda was a great democratizer and a great reformer and a great innovator. And people like that always get blowback. But now, here we are, all these years later, and the impact is readily seen. I'm avoiding the temptation of saying too much because we have limited time. I just wrote a 300-page biography, so there's a lot to be said. But one of the things I want to single out is how hard he worked. My interest in taking on the task of writing a biography of Yogananda was to tell the human story. He was everything you can say about him as a spiritual being, as a historic figure, as a cosmic force. He was also a human being, as was Vivekananda, as was all the other gurus, and presumably realized souls who graced the planet. They all had human characteristics and backgrounds and everything. And some of the most moving things in Yogananda's life were those human elements, like deciding to come to America and breaking his father's heart. His father didn't want him to leave. He had already lost his eldest son to death, and now the now eldest son was leaving. First became a Swami when he wanted him to get married and have a career, which he said no to on several occasions. And now he was leaving for the distant shores of America. They weren't going to be able to Skype and get on a plane to come home for Christmas or something. I mean, it wasn't like that. And if you ever had the opportunity to hear Yogananda speak about that, there are CDs available now, where his father said, okay, I'll help you get there. By the way, Davey spoke this morning about him having $500. I too saw the ship manifest from when he arrived, and he had $500. So I looked it up. That's $6,500 today. That sounds like a lot of money, but it wouldn't get you very far in Boston and environs, for now. But anyway, father kept sending money. And but he said to his father said, how long will you be gone? And he said, 3 months, if the Americans don't need me. And he stayed 32 years, with the exception of the year and a half he was abroad, a year of which was spent in India. And that, too, is deeply moving to read about, because family reunion and the death of Sri Yukteswar while he was there, his father's aging, and knowing it might be the last time he saw him. All these human factors, to me, just made Yogananda more real and more admirable in my eyes, because you identify with the human being when you read about it, when you research it, when you read his letters and see that how hard he was working and how he had to deal with people like us and people at the Mother Center, and arguing and squabbling and disappointing him, and lawsuits and accusations and money problems and the Great Depression and all this stuff. It was, you don't see much of that in the autobiography of a yogi, because he wasn't going to reveal those kinds of things. It's not what the book was about. And the book was not, frankly, that much about his time in America, which is one of the reasons I decided to write a biography of him. I wrote a chapter about him in American Veda, but his mission was, I don't know if he would think it was successful enough, because he took that mission seriously. There were times he wanted to go back to India and give it all up because of life in America and the hassles and everything was just, it was hard. But he didn't. He had this mission, he had this dharma, and he was going to stick it out. I don't know if now he would say, oh yes, it was successful. He had high standards. He may think it wasn't successful enough. But I can tell you from my research that in addition to all of people like you, presumably, who are devotees of Yogananda, and there's millions of you around the world, there are even more people whose spiritual lives were influenced by him, who took different paths. Back in the 60s and 70s, when all the gurus were coming here, a big part of the people who went to them had read the autobiography of a yogi, and they were looking for something. And maybe they didn't go to a Yogananda teaching, maybe they didn't sign up for the lessons, but they went and learned TM or found Muktananda or Satchidananda or one of these people. Countless numbers. Countless devotees of all the different gurus who read autobiography of a yogi at another time in their journey, and it impacted them. I run into them all the time. When I was interviewing people for American Veda, I said, how did you come to these yogic teachings? And if they mentioned a book, it was invariably autobiography of a yogi. The second most mentioned book, a distant second, was Ram Dass's Be Here Now. But when I interviewed Ram Dass, he mentioned autobiography of a yogi. So the impact is not to be underestimated. He made a mark that will endure and continues to endure. And I want to use my last few minutes to encourage all of you to follow his example. Now, we are living in perilous times, and I have a book coming out in August called Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times. And I'm arguing there that the spiritual practice is both a sanctuary, we have this sanctuary within us, but it is also a way of strengthening ourselves for productive action in the world. It's not just, they're not means of escape. The Bhagavad Gita has as its main protagonist a warrior, not a renunciate. And he was told, be a yogi. The most important verse in the Gita to me, the Sanskrit is yogastha kurumani. Established in yoga, perform action. In Arjuna's case, it was to fight. In your case, it might be run for office. It might be just get your friends to vote. It might just be volunteer work. But whatever it is, all of us who are serious about our spiritual lives, who have a rich inner life, who have contact with the divinity within us and the wisdom and the compassion that comes with that, it is imperative upon us to do something, to make a mark, to contribute. When I say, and Yogananda is a role model for that. That's what he did. He was a Swami. There was a part of him that just wanted to go live in a cave or in an ashram on the Ganges. But he had a mission, and he performed that mission, but he was first a yogi. He was established in yoga, and then he performed action. And he worked hard, and he worked persistently, and he worked with dedication and as much skill as he could muster. Whatever your gift is to the world, use that as an example, because the world needs spiritual solutions, and the world needs spiritual beings who have something to offer, whatever it is. So I hope you take that message seriously, and thank you for having me. Thank you for reading my books. Thank you for being here. I'd shake all of your hands, but we're not supposed to. Take namaste seriously.